What if MAGA rule so dismantles the institutions of representative democracy that normal institutional processes are insufficient to overcome tyranny? Around the world, general strikes, people power uprisings, and other forms of social strikes have overthrown violent, armed dictatorships. What conditions might put social strikes on the agenda in the United States? An authoritarian takeover is underway in the U.S., complete with the arrest of opposition political leaders, unrestrained executive usurpation, and lawless physical violence and kidnapping by masked, unidentified armed federal agents. As detailed in Chapter 1, forms of mass, non-violent people power uprising have forestalled or reversed such takeovers in many other countries, ranging from the Philippines to Serbia to South Korea. Yet as we saw in Chapter 2, the United States has little tradition of using such social strikes to oppose tyranny. Could social strikes nonetheless play a significant role in countering Trump's developing autocracy? What conditions put social strikes on the agenda? Growing disaffection of the population, leading to a great repudiation by a large majority. As a study a century ago noted, strike conditions are conditions of mind. Social strikes are unlikely to happen before a large proportion of the population are enraged at the MAGA tyranny, dubious that more moderate forms of action will suffice, and willing to take personal and institutional risks to oppose it. Growing self-organization and capacity to act by the movement-based opposition and forces of social self-defense more broadly. This involves cooperation among national organizations and networks. Even more important is local organization, formal or informal, that is able to act and coordinate with others. Such networks need to be able to persist despite pervasive repression. Actions by the movement-based opposition that win wide popular support and participation. Exemplary actions that visibly oppose the harm the regime is doing and show that people can stand up and resist it can help lay the groundwork for mass participation in social strikes. Internal conflicts within the regime. As Abraham Lincoln observed, a house divided against itself cannot stand. A divided regime is less able to engage in a strategy of either consistent repression or of manipulative concessions. Undermine pillars of support. Every regime depends on the support of its supporters, whether that takes the form of campaign contributors, propagandists, or soldiers, police, or other agents of repression. Disaffection in the instruments of repression. Turning points in civil resistance in the Philippines, Serbia, and many other cases came when police and soldiers opposed a coup or refused to fire on protesters. Lack of concessions or reforms from the regime. It is a truism that the powerful defeat challenges to their power through a combination of repression and concession. A ruling force may appear strong because it never backs down, but in the long term, such pig-headedness is likely to force more and more of society into opposition. Ineffectiveness of other forms of opposition. Many people, quite reasonably, will prefer conventional forms of institutional resistance to ameliorate their conditions rather than undertake risky ventures like social strikes. The failure of less drastic forms of resistance often lays the groundwork for social strikes. Clearly, such conditions for social strikes do not currently exist in the U.S. However, there are harbingers that may point toward the emergence of such conditions. For example, millions of people have participated in a series of days of action opposing MAGA autocracy and its Gestapo tactics, its decimating of food, housing, and healthcare for millions of Americans, and its destruction of our climate and environment. Polls demonstrate that a majority of the public has increasingly opposed such Trump initiatives. Meanwhile, the Trump administration has been riven by firings, resignations, and other signs of internal conflict. The MAGA movement was sharply divided by the U.S. bombing of Iran and the concealment of documents about Jeffrey Epstein. While many universities, law firms, and other institutions have caved into Trump demands, others are moving to public opposition. Some key elements of support for the Trump regime have gone into opposition. Disaffection was widely reported among the National Guards and Marines sent to repress the people of Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. Despite the growth of public opposition, the Trump MAGA modus operandi seems to have little or no role for concessions to placate opponents or win back disillusioned neutrals and supporters. Although all of these factors might provide favorable conditions for a reinvigorated opposition in the political arena, the leadership of the Democratic Party has so far failed to provide such an opposition. Social strikes could result from actions by the regime and its supporters or from initiatives by the opposition that stimulate mass popular action. Mark and Paul Engler write in their book, This is an Uprising, that a strategy of nonviolent escalation can sometimes set off historic upheavals of their own. They offer numerous examples, including Gandhi's salt marches, that mobilized India against British imperialism, Rosa Parks' refusal to go to the back of the bus and segregated Montgomery in 1955, which triggered the Montgomery bus boycott and helped start the entire civil rights revolution, and the protest suicide of a Tunisian fruit seller that set off the ouster of the Tunisian dictatorship and the start of the Arab Spring. In 2 of the 4 case studies in Chapter 1 above, social strikes in the Philippines in 1986 and Serbia in 2000 were a response to efforts to perpetuate authoritarian rule by stealing elections. The 2024 social strike in South Korea was a response to an attempted presidential coup. Puerto Rico's 2019 social strike was a response to the disclosure of outrageous behavior by top officials that violated a wide range of shared norms. Social strike can also be triggered by outrageous violence on the part of the regime. All of these cases illustrate Gandhi's maxim that even the most powerful cannot rule without the cooperation and/or acquiescence of the ruled. In all these cases, popular mobilization and the threat of general social disruption were so great that the autocrat's supporters abandoned or turned against him and forced him to resign. The timelines for such scenarios are largely unpredictable. The popular mobilizations in the Philippines and Serbia built for many months. Those in South Korea and Puerto Rico responded to sudden events and removed their targets within weeks. Such events are full of unknown unknowns. While preparing for what can be anticipated is valuable, it is no substitute for constantly keeping watch and experimentally testing the waters to see what is actually happening in people's hearts and minds. Today's expressions of popular disaffection from Trump and MAGA do not guarantee that social strikes will become possible, that they will occur, or that they will succeed. But they do provide good reason to consider them as a possible strategic horizon for the growing movement for social self-defense. Mass people power uprisings, general strikes, and other forms of withdrawal of popular acquiescence and tyranny have established or restored democracy in many countries. As we saw in the previous chapter, while the conditions for such social strikes are far from mature in the U.S. at present, a time may come when they are both necessary and possible. How can that eventuality be prepared for? The conditions under which social strikes might occur in the U.S. are mostly unknowable, so preparation can't be for a specific type of event or action. We must be prepared for a wide range of possibilities. There is no predicting how those in power would respond to a social strike. Repression is almost certain, but its forms, extent, and success are not. Martial law and shooting down demonstrators in the street are surely not beyond their limits. Conversely, under sufficient pressure, regimes often negotiate, as happened for example in the roundtable discussions between the Polish government and the Solidarity Union that ended an authoritarian rule in Poland in 1989. Challenges to authoritarian regimes can end in their surrender, often in the form of resignation, flight, or arrest of top officials. They can also end in collapse, for example, in the melting away of Serbian police and military forces on which the regime depended. Although social strikes often seem to emerge suddenly and unexpectedly, they are frequently preceded by less visible organizing and smaller scale actions. The Democratic Party currently failing to effectively play the role of an opposition party, there is an important role for non-electoral opposition that can mobilize those harmed by MAGA, identify common interests, unify their programs and actions, and articulate alternatives. A movement-based opposition has developed since Trump's election, exemplified by the participation of millions in protest days of action like Hands Off, May Day Strong, and No King's Day, and the mass civil resistance to ICE raids and National Guard occupation in Los Angeles and around the country. That movement-based opposition is part of a developmental process that could, depending on circumstances, culminate in social strikes. Indivisible's 1 Million Rising, which is described as a national effort to train 1 million people in the strategic logic and practice of non-cooperation, could be a step in preparing the participants in mass protests for social strikes. Ongoing social self-defense can progressively incorporate elements of non-cooperation and disruption that evolve towards social strikes and serve as a living representation of their political power. They can combine strikes with non-workplace actions like boycotts, commercial shutdowns, mass picketing, blockades, occupation, and civil disobedience. Such actions will need to constantly seek the sweet spot between effective disruption of MAGA oppression and alienation of forces that might otherwise be won over. Successful social strikes depend on support from sources of power that go far beyond established social movements. They require, and often acquire, support from sectors like educational, medical, and legal professionals, civil society institutions like universities, hospitals, and religious denominations, and political forces including local and state governments, legislators, judges, jurors, sectors of government agencies and security forces, and segments of political parties. Such forces often join social strikes not out of fondness for social movements, but from a growing understanding that eliminating an autocracy may be necessary for their own self-preservation and the preservation of society itself. for social self-defense. A general strike has conventionally been defined as a coordinated work stoppage by trade unions in many different sectors. In a variety of countries, general strikes are relatively common, but as indicated in Chapter 2 above, they have been a rarity in the U.S. Any proposal for a general strike must also take into account the fact that fewer than 10% of U.S. workers are currently members of unions. While an effective social strike will certainly require wide participation by union members, U.S. unions are unlikely to join as a bloc. For example, through the AFL-CIO in a social strike, the reasons for this are explained in Chapter 2. Union participation can, however, be promoted in advance by resolutions and educational campaigns. For example, in the midst of the 2011 Wisconsin uprising, the 90 unions belonging to the Madison Region's South Central Federation of Labor voted to set up a mechanism to promote discussion and education about general strikes. A recent article titled "To Stop Trump, Unions Need Joint Campaigns and a Shared Vision" by Jackson Potter, Vice President of the Chicago Teachers Union, and Alex Capucho Pearl, former President of United Teachers Los Angeles, lays out a strategy for drawing organized labor more deeply into the struggle against Trump and MAGA. They say, "We must build up to strike readiness through greater organizing and collaboration by large locals and labor councils, and through escalating direct actions involving members and non-members alike. As Trump's authoritarianism escalates, we have to broaden our tent to include labor community coalitions. We have to draw on a range of tactics, like consumer boycotts, sick-outs, and slowdowns. We need to re-energize union structures at the national, state, and local levels and line up political and contract demands. We can now conceive of a new period of social strikes, mass strikes, general strikes, or other large-scale nonviolent actions. To pull this off in short order will require strategic convenings, regional meetups with key players across the labor movement, and in powerful community organizations, and an orientation to pressuring politicians and corporate titans to reject creeping authoritarianism." Can unions plan for a general strike in the future that may not violate the terms of their contracts? The UAW has called to align all union contract terminations for May 1, 2028, as a way to promote united action and perhaps even a general strike by circumventing the prohibition on striking during a union contract. That call has already promoted wider discussions of general strikes in labor and social movement circles. Of course, different unions striking at the same time does not guarantee a united front around issues of common concern. The first half of 1946 saw nearly 3 million workers simultaneously on strike in auto, steel, coal, railroad, and many other important industries, but unions pursued separate demands, made little effort to pool their strength, and reached settlements with little consideration of the impact on those remaining on strike. To avoid such a fate, simultaneous strikes by different unions will need common demands and a solidarity that keeps them united through the course of the struggle. Self-organization at the grassroots will be a crucial ingredient for any social strike. This will be especially so under conditions of serious repression, when unions and other large-scale organizations are likely to be under a mobilizing attack. Social strikes against MAGA tyranny are unlikely to follow a preconceived plan. They require flexible improvisation, but that doesn't mean there is no way to prepare for them. The best preparation is to have cadres in place, grassroots activists who understand the need for and possibility of social strikes. To paraphrase Flight Attendants Union President Sarah Nelson, these people who are already engaged in coordinated solidarity and who are ready to strike.